Welcome to Dream Story Sleep, where old tales are whispered slowly, like wind through tall grass at dusk. There are no bright lights here, no noise, no rush, only the hush of a voice meant to quiet your thoughts. You don't need to follow every word. You don't need to stay awake. Just let it flow. Let the day fade, the tension ease, and the world grow distant. If tonight's story brought you peace, please consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a small comment. Tell me what time you listened, or how it made you feel. These simple notes mean more than you know. They keep this quiet space alive night after night. In this busy world, stillness is rare, and your presence here is a gift. Thank you for choosing rest. Thank you for listening. Now close your eyes, breathe softly, and let the story dissolve into sleep.
Imagine waking up. A feeble ray of sunlight filters through a crack in the mud wall. A dim glow, not quite strong enough to cut through the damp chill that clings to your small hut. You rub your eyes, trying to adjust to the murky gloom. The scent of damp earth, lingering smoke from last night's fire, and the distinct smell of bodies crammed into a tight space fills your nostrils. The rickety thatched roof above you is dotted with early morning dew, occasionally dripping, drip, drip, onto the cold dirt floor. This isn't a pleasant dream. It's just another typical morning for a peasant in the Middle Ages. A question probably pops into your head right about now. How long would someone like you, used to modern life, with all the comforts and conveniences we take for granted, actually survive in this harsh world? The answer might just send shivers down your spine. We often hear about magnificent castles, brave knights, and romantic tales of the nobility. But that's just a tiny, glamorous slice of the larger medieval pie. The brutal reality was far grimmer. Nearly 90% of the population during this period were peasants, small, impoverished people living quiet, almost invisible lives within the currents of history. They weren't powerful lords nor learned monks, but rather hard-working farmers, toiling day in and day out on the land just to scrape by. Their lives were so incredibly tough, it's hard for us, living in the abundant and convenient 21st century, to even fathom. Today, I am going to transport you back in time, into that challenging setting. We'll explore the reasons why a modern person, no matter how strong or resilient, would likely struggle to survive long as a peasant in the medieval ages. Get ready, because what we're about to uncover will paint a completely different picture from the one we usually imagine from fairy tales and movies. The chill wasn't just in the air. It had steeped itself into the very marrow of your bones, a constant, dull throb that had been your unwavering companion through the meager hours of darkness. Before consciousness truly knitted itself together, before a single coherent thought could form, there was only this pervasive, insistent cold. It clung to your eyelids, seeped through the thin, threadbare blanket, and pressed against every inch of your skin. This wasn't the crisp, invigorating chill of a fresh winter morning in a sturdy, well-built home.
This was the damp, suffocating cold of a living tomb, a crude dwelling fashioned from mud, wattle, and straw, barely holding the brutal elements at bay. Your hut was a singular, cramped chamber, an existence defined by its meager, claustrophobic boundaries. Its walls, constructed from a crude lattice of interwoven branches plastered with mud and straw, offered pitifully scant insulation against winter's relentless grasp. Through countless unseen fissures and hairline cracks, the pre-dawn gloom, thick and palpable, infiltrated the space. It carried with it the frigid breath of the outside world, a chilling current that danced across the packed earth floor. There were no windows, only a low, narrow doorway, often covered by a tattered scrap of animal hide or an old sack. This flimsy barrier did little to prevent the wind from spiraling inward, a mournful, relentless wail that seemed to penetrate the very fabric of your being. This was the wind of the north, ancient and unforgiving, whispering chilling tales of frostbite and famine as it snaked through every imperfection of your precarious dwelling. Your bed was nothing more than a shallow depression in the earth floor, sparingly lined with a scattering of old, dry straw, if you were fortunate. More often than not, it was damp, compacted, and bristled with unseen insects, small, scuttling things that were as much a part of your nightly routine as the cold. This straw, which once might have been golden and fragrant, had long since become a matted, dusty, and perpetually damp mass, flattened by the weight of bodies night after night, season after season. It smelled of raw earth, stale sweat, and an undefinable mustiness that had permeated every thread of your clothing, every single hair on your head. This was the omnipresent scent of your life, the smell of ingrained poverty and relentless physical existence, a smell that clung to you like a second skin, utterly impossible to wash away. As a faint flicker of awareness ignited, your first conscious thought was almost invariably of the chill. It was a primary, undeniable sensation. Your breath, visible in the frigid air, plumed in small ghost-like clouds above your face, a stark visual representation of the cold's absolute dominion. Your fingers, instinctively curled into fists for warmth, were stiff, almost numb, their joints aching with a dull, persistent pain that was both intimately familiar and utterly unwelcome. Your toes, likewise, felt like lumps of ice, despite being tucked deep beneath the collective warmth of bodies huddled so close. The blood in your extremities felt sluggish, thick, unwilling to circulate freely in the oppressive cold. You were never truly alone on this straw pallet. Your family, your spouse, perhaps 2, 3, or even more children, their ages ranging from an infant at your wife's breast to a gangly teenager, and sometimes an elderly parent or two, were all intertwined in a desperate silent battle against the cold. Limbs tangled, bodies pressed together in an unconscious, primal need for shared warmth. The thin, coarse woolen blanket, patched countless times with scraps of whatever fabric could be found, was pulled taut over the communal mass, offering more psychological reassurance than actual insulation. Each subtle shift of a sleeping body sent a ripple of colder air through the small, precious pocket of warmth you had collectively generated, forcing a subconscious readjustment, a tighter curl, a deeper press against a warm back. There was no concept of privacy, only the shared burden of existence. The sounds of the hut were as familiar as the ache in your bones, forming a consistent backdrop to your life. The gentle, rhythmic rise and fall of breaths, some deep and resonant, others shallow and reedy, whispered in the darkness. The occasional soft whimper of a dreaming child, quickly hushed by an instinctive nudge from a parent or a comforting, gentle pat. And then, inevitably, the coughs. A ragged, wet cough would tear through the stillness, rattling in a thin chest, followed by another and another, a chain reaction of human vulnerability. It might be your own, a dry, hacking sound that scraped against your raw throat, or it might be your youngest, a wheezing, struggling sound that sent a jolt of helpless concern through your weary mind. These coughs were the constant soundtrack of your existence, a perpetual reminder of the damp, the ever-present smoke, the inadequate nutrition, and the insidious diseases that lurked like silent, unseen predators in the shadows of your life. The air itself was a heavy, stagnant thing, thick with the lingering scent of last night's fire, a dense mix of wood smoke, perhaps some damp peat, and the undeniable smell of damp earth. It clung to everything, permeating your clothes, your hair, the very mud walls of the hut. It was a smell that never truly dissipated, mingling inextricably with the ever-present odor of unwashed bodies, stale food, and the faint, unsettling tang of mildew that seemed to grow on every surface, especially in the darker, more secluded corners. Your nose, perpetually accustomed to these smells, barely registered them consciously. Yet they were an integral, defining part of the sensory tapestry of your world. Occasionally, a faint, sweetish sour whiff would drift over, the telltale sign of fermenting or moldy foodstuffs stored in a corner, a testament to the constant, losing battle against spoilage and waste. Outside, the world was still cloaked in profound, inky darkness, but a subtle change in the quality of the wind, a barely perceptible shift in the ambient sounds, hinted at the slow, grudging approach of dawn. The deepest hours of night, when the cold was most absolute, and the world seemed entirely given over to slumber, were beginning to recede. But this wasn't a promise of warmth or light, nor a herald of ease. It was merely a signal that the moment of waking, the true inevitable beginning of another cycle of relentless toil, was drawing relentlessly near. Your internal clock, honed by generations of rising with the sun and sleeping with the dark, stirred you long before any actual light could be seen. There was no rooster's crow in your immediate vicinity, perhaps only the distant, muffled bray of a donkey from a neighboring farm, or the faint, bleating call of a sheep from the communal pasture. Your body simply knew. It was a deep, ancestral knowing, etched into your very being by the relentless demands of the land and the unyielding will of the Lord. The physical act of rising was an ordeal in itself, a testament to sheer, grinding willpower. Every muscle protested, every joint groaned in stiff complaint. Your back, perpetually strained and twisted from years of bending over fields, felt like a single, rigid board, resistant to any movement. Your legs, stiff and cramped from being curled for hours in the tight sleeping space, burned with pins and needles as blood slowly, painfully returned to your extremities. A wave of dizziness might momentarily wash over you as you pushed yourself upright, your vision blurring from the sudden change in blood pressure after hours of recumbency. Each breath felt shallow, the air cold and thin in your lungs. As you pushed yourself up, careful not to disturb the still sleeping forms around you, their rest, however fitful, was precious. The cold seemed to intensify, wrapping around you like a shroud. The straw rustled beneath you, a dry, whispering sound, and microscopic particles of dust and chaff rose into the air, dancing in what little light might eventually enter the hut. Your clothes, the same coarse tunic and breeches you wore day in and day out, were stiff with the cold and the ingrained grime of days, perhaps weeks of wear. Pulling them on or simply adjusting them tighter around your shivering frame felt less like getting dressed and more like donning a suit of uncomfortable, scratchy armor. There was no thought of cleanliness, no personal ritual of refreshing yourself. Washing was a rare, arduous affair, usually involving hauling buckets of frigid water from the communal well, and certainly not something undertaken on a dark, frigid winter morning when every ounce of warmth was a treasure. The very concept of personal hygiene as we know it simply didn't exist for you. Your skin felt perpetually gritty, your hair greasy and matted, your breath a stale, unpleasant reflection of the meager meal from the night before. Lice and fleas were constant companions, an accepted, if irritating part of the daily reality. Their tiny bites a minor torment in the grand scheme of discomfort. You scratched an itch on your scalp, a familiar, unconscious gesture born of habit and necessity. From the embers in the hearth, a faint, thin wisp of smoke still curled upwards, a testament to the dying warmth. You would have to rekindle the fire soon, a crucial task that involved carefully blowing on the glowing remnants, adding small twigs and then larger, often damp pieces of wood, patiently coaxing the reluctant flame back into vibrant life. The smoke, even from a freshly burning fire, always seemed to hang low in the hut, stinging your eyes and irritating your lungs, a constant, unwelcome companion that contributed to the persistent coughs of almost everyone in the family. Your ancestors had built and breathed the smoke from fires like this for millennia, and their lungs, like yours, bore the indelible, often fatal mark of constant smoke inhalation. The air tasted of ash and burning wood, a flavor as ancient as humanity itself. And then the smell that truly signaled the dawn of another day, a scent that heralded the immediate future, the faint, familiar, and utterly unappetizing aroma of yesterday's porridge, sitting in a rough earthenware pot near the hearth. It was thin, watery, made from whatever meager grain was available, often barley or oats, sometimes rye, never wheat. It had cooled overnight, congealed slightly into a bland grayish mass, and carried the unmistakable tang of fermentation, perhaps even a distinct hint of mildew or sourness on its surface. This wasn't a hearty breakfast designed to fuel a day of demanding labor. It was mere sustenance, a bland, gruel-like mixture designed to provide just enough caloric intake to get you through the first few hours of brutal labor. There was no variety, no spice, no sweetness, just the same tasteless, slightly sour concoction, Day after day, week after week, a monotonous cycle of barely adequate nourishment. There was no joy in this waking, no anticipation of a new day's possibilities, only a profound sense of inevitability, a quiet, deep-seated resignation. Your mind, dulled by perpetual exhaustion, poor nutrition, and the sheer monotony of existence, rarely strayed into abstract thought or hopeful musings. The immediate, tangible realities of cold, hunger, and impending labor consumed your every faculty, leaving little room for anything else. Dreams, if you had them, were often nightmares of starvation or violence, or perhaps fleeting, distorted glimpses of a comfort so alien it defied true comprehension, like fragments of a forgotten better life. This was the start of your day, not a gentle awakening, but a forced, painful emergence from a shallow, unfulfilling slumber. Your body, despite its rest, still cried out for more, for warmth, for sustenance, for a moment of true peace. But there was no time for such luxuries. The sun would soon cast its pale, indifferent light over the frozen fields, and the Lord's bailiff would expect to see you there, alongside every other soul capable of wielding a hoe or guiding a plow. Punishment for tardiness, or even the appearance of laziness, was a harsh reality. The internal struggle, the battle between your protesting body and the crushing weight of necessity, was swift and silent. The desire for continued oblivion fought briefly against the ingrained habit of survival, the stark reality of gnawing hunger, and the chilling fear of the Lord's punishment. Necessity, a harsher master than any feudal lord, always won. With a sigh that was more a creak from your protesting lungs than an expression of emotion, you would begin to stir fully, your movements slowly, reluctantly rousing the others from their communal slumber. This wasn't a life of leisure or choice. You didn't wake up to decide your day's tasks or ponder the meaning of existence. Your existence was a continuous, brutal cycle, dictated by the seasons, the unpredictable whims of nature, and the unyielding demands of your feudal superiors. Every morning was a testament to sheer endurance, a battle won simply by rising and facing another day of back-breaking toil, meager food, and relentless discomfort. This was the raw, unvarnished truth of a peasant's life in the medieval ages, a reality so far removed from our own that it almost defies belief. And this waking moment, before the sun had even hinted at its ascent, was just the first cold tremor of that relentless truth, a harbinger of the ceaseless struggle ahead. As the first reluctant streaks of sunlight barely pierced through the thick morning mist, it was the undeniable signal for another grueling day to begin. For you, a medieval peasant, a day wasn't measured in hours, but by the relentless march of the sun across the sky. From the moment the sun peaked over the horizon until darkness completely swallowed the world, every single moment was an unyielding struggle for survival. You'd step out of your hut, not to breathe in fresh, crisp air, but to confront the stark reality of your village. The very path leading to the fields was a muddy labyrinth, thick with animal dung. The pungent stench hung heavy, mixing with the biting morning chill.
This was the familiar road you'd walked thousands of times, each step sinking deep into the wet, clinging earth. Farm work devoured every waking second. Whether it was hoeing the soil, harvesting the crops, or planting seeds, every task demanded immense physical strength and relentless, monotonous repetition. With a heavy wooden hoe, you'd break open the rock-hard ground in winter, or the waterlogged soil in the rainy season, one laborious swing at a time. Your back would ache, bent double, muscles screaming in protest. Sweat would pour off you, even in the bitter cold, soaking through your coarse tunic. There was no machinery, no modern tools. Everything depended on human strength, each hoe stroke, each scythe swing, slow and manual. During harvest season, the work intensified tenfold. You'd spend hours bent over under the scorching sun or in the biting wind, meticulously cutting each stalk of wheat, corn, or barley with a scythe or sickle. Your hands, calloused and rough, would often bleed from cuts by the sharp blades or the tough, dry stalks. The greatest fear wasn't the physical pain, but a failed harvest. A poor crop meant imminent starvation, the outbreak of disease, and sometimes death itself. Your entire family, including your small children, would join in this labor, their eyes dulled by exhaustion and hunger. After the harvest, the work was far from over. The grain had to be brought back to your hut or to the Lord's mill. Grinding grain and pounding flour was another chain of repetitive, mind-numbing, and incredibly heavy tasks. You might have to use a manual stone quern, grinding each kernel one by one, or wait for your turn at the watermill, where you'd still expend significant effort to turn the heavy millstones. The flour, once ground, wasn't fine and soft like we know, but coarse, often mixed with impurities and bits of husk. Your meals were quick, simple, and almost entirely unvarying. Lunch was usually a thin bowl of gruel, made from the coarsest grains, sometimes supplemented with a few wild greens you managed to forage along the path or from your tiny garden plot. It had almost no flavor, serving merely to fill an empty, aching stomach. Dinner, if it was any better, consisted of a chunk of rough, dark bread, often dense and hard as rock, sometimes dipped in a bit of lard or cheap cheese if you were lucky. Meat was an unimaginable luxury, appearing only on rare feast days and usually the lowest quality cuts. Your drink was well water, often unfiltered and easily carrying disease. There was no time for true rest or recreation. In the evenings, after the sun had set and you'd trudged back to your cold, damp hut, the only light came from the flickering fire in the hearth, or perhaps an animal fat candle, if your family was fortunate. There you might have to repair tools, mend clothes, or tend to the perpetually coughing children. Sleep came swiftly, not from comfort, but from the sheer, utter exhaustion of your body. A peasant's day wasn't a romantic adventure or a tale of heroism. It was a relentless loop of brutal physical labor, confronting a harsh natural world and living in perpetual scarcity. There was no time for personal growth, for education, or for dreams that stretched beyond the confines of the fields. Your life, from sun-up until there was no light left, was a vivid testament to human resilience in a world that demanded everything and rarely gave back enough.
If the summer months brought relentless labor under a relentless sun, winter arrived with a different challenge, more insidious, yet no less brutal. It was a constant battle against the pervasive cold, the inescapable damp, and the insidious creep of sickness. As the days grew shorter and the air bit sharper, your humble mud hut transformed into a damp, stifling trap, a stark testament to humanity's vulnerability against nature's raw power. Inside your dwelling, the presence of mildew wasn't just a faint odor, it was an overwhelming, ever-present reality. The heavy, musty smell of damp earth and mold was so pungent you could almost taste it on your tongue, a bitter, acrid flavor that never quite left your mouth. You could see the telltale patches of greenish-gray and dark black spreading like a blight across the mud walls, where moisture stubbornly seeped through from the outside, forming beads of condensation that then trickled down, leaving dark, weeping trails. Your hand would instinctively brush against the wall, feeling the clammy, unpleasantly sticky texture of the perpetually damp earth. Even the straw on the floor felt heavy with moisture, compacted and emanating a faint decaying smell. Mildew clung to your clothes, to your few meager possessions, and even to the precious scraps of dark bread hung from the rafters to keep them from rats. It was a silent invader, relentlessly gnawing away at your health and your spirits. This relentless cold and damp with a breeding ground for a myriad of diseases. The ragged, wet cough was the most familiar sound in your home, a constant rattling symphony. Consumption, or tuberculosis, was the dreaded enemy. It attacked the lungs, making every breath a struggle, slowly eroding the life force of the afflicted. Lingering fevers, bone-chilling cold, and incessant coughing fits rapidly sapped the body's strength. Beyond consumption, infections were a constant looming threat. A small cut from field work, a scraped knee from stumbling in the darkness, or even a simple insect bite could quickly turn into a festering, swollen sore due to the dire lack of hygiene and medicine. And when sickness inevitably struck, you had almost nothing to fight back with. There was no proper medicine. The whispered folk remedies passed down through generations might offer a fleeting moment of relief for pain or fever, but they were utterly powerless against serious illnesses. The village healer, if your settlement even had one, could only rely on rudimentary experience or superstitious rituals. Death was an unavoidable part of life, particularly during the harsh winter months. Children and the elderly were often the first victims, but even the strongest among you could succumb to a virulent fever or a seemingly simple infection. The smoke from your hearth, while a source of precious warmth, was also an inseparable part of your life and a silent, insidious killer. All day long, and especially in winter, when the fire burned continuously to ward off the chill, the smell of acrid smoke permeated everything. Your hair perpetually reeked of smoke, even when you weren't near the hearth. Your clothes, no matter how rarely they were washed, never truly lost the stale, ingrained smell of old smoke. This odor didn't just cling to material possessions. It seeped deep into your lungs, making your breathing heavy and exacerbating respiratory problems. It was the scent of existence, but also the scent of illness and slow decay. During the longest, coldest winter nights, when temperatures plunged to freezing, everyone in your family would huddle together in a tight, tangled mass. This wasn't driven by affection, but by pure, unadulterated survival instinct. The body heat emanating from each person was a precious commodity, and by sleeping pressed close, you collectively created a slightly warmer nest against the biting cold. The rhythmic breathing, the gentle shifts in sleep, and even the ragged coughs all blended into a communal hum in the oppressive darkness. While privacy was non-existent and comfort was almost nil, this desperate act of huddling was a stark testament to humanity's powerful will to survive, an unwilling unity against the deadly encroaching cold. Winter inside the mud hut wasn't just a season of the year. It was a terrifying experience, a relentless fight against the elements and the unseen, lurking diseases. It was the time when life was most precarious, and death always seemed to linger at the threshold, a constant, unwelcome visitor.
When sickness swept through your village, it wasn't just a personal fear. It was a pervasive threat that hung over the entire community. There were no hospitals, no trained doctors as we know them today. The fight against illness was a solitary, often losing battle. Instead of doctors, your villagers could only rely on the local healer or elderly women who possessed a rudimentary knowledge of herbs and whispered folk remedies passed down through generations. Their knowledge was often a blend of practical experience, deep-seated beliefs, and outright superstitions. They might apply poultices of crushed plants, brew bitter concoctions, or perform prayers and simple rituals to ward off evil spirits believed to be the cause of the affliction. The effectiveness of these methods was severely limited, often only providing fleeting symptomatic relief or no tangible benefit at all beyond offering a desperate, fragile hope. When a member of your family fell gravely ill, the scene was typically stark and grim. The sick person lay prone, shivering uncontrollably on their damp, rough straw bed, their weakened body unable to raise itself. Fever made their forehead burn, their eyes glazed over, staring blankly into the void. Their clothes would cling to them, soaked with sweat, yet their entire body would still convulse in shivers from the cold that seemed to invade them from within. This wasn't the comfort of a warm, clean bed. It was a continuous torment on a cold, foul-smelling straw pallet. In the cramped, dimly lit confines of the hut, the sounds of sickness became haunting. The heavy, wheezing breaths of the ill person, each inhale and exhale a palpable struggle against the encroaching shadow of death, seemed to fill every corner. Dry, hacking coughs ripped through the air, tearing at the heartstrings. Sometimes it was the faint, pitiable whimpers of a small child battling a high fever, their desperate wails quickly fading into shallow, gasping sobs. These sounds were like knives twisting in the hearts of those still healthy, leaving them feeling utterly helpless and terrified. There was almost nothing that could be done to alleviate the suffering, beyond perhaps placing a cool, damp cloth on a burning forehead, or whispering fervent prayers for a miracle that rarely came. And then death would occur silently, as an inevitable part of life. In the village, death was not a rare or sudden event, but a familiar, uninvited visitor.
There were no exaggerated laments, no elaborate modern rituals. One morning you would simply wake to find a family member had drawn their last breath. Their face might be peaceful, but their body lay cold and inert. This grim acceptance stemmed from a simple, brutal reality. Death was always lurking, and life was simply too hard, too demanding for prolonged grief or elaborate mourning. The deceased would be buried quickly, often wrapped only in a simple shroud, in a small churchyard, or at the very edge of the communal fields. Life for the survivors simply had to continue. There was always work to be done, mouths to feed, and another dawn to face. In the medieval ages, sickness and death were not the exception. They were the grim, pervasive rule. Every cough, every fever was a stark, chilling reminder that the life of a peasant was a thin, fragile thread, liable to snap at any moment, with no intervention or hope from modern medicine.
The brutal realities of medieval peasant life were often dictated by forces far beyond human control, powers as ancient and unyielding as the earth itself. If disease was the silent predator lurking in the shadows, then crop failure was the roaring beast that descended from the skies, leaving a trail of desolation and despair. And in the medieval ages, few disasters were as universally feared or as utterly devastating as a season when the sky withheld its vital tears. It began subtly, an insidious creeping dread rather than a sudden catastrophe. Weeks passed without the accustomed spring showers that nurtured the newly sown seeds. The sun, once a welcome promise of warmth after the long winter, became a relentless, merciless eye in a sky of unbroken, mocking blue. Day after day it beat down with an intensity that sucked the very life out of the soil. The air, usually thick with the promise of rain-washed growth, grew thin and brittle, tasting of dust and the faint sweet scent of dying vegetation. The wind, which in kinder seasons rustled playfully through emerging green shoots, now sighed a dry, mournful lament, carrying only fine particles of topsoil that settled everywhere, a gritty layer on skin, hair, and the few meager possessions within the hut. You'd step out each morning, your hope a fragile thing clinging to the edges of your consciousness, only for it to shrivel under the sun's merciless gaze. Beneath your calloused bare feet, the earth itself was a cruel mockery. What should have been rich, damp soil, yielding and fertile, was now a network of cracked, fissured ground, wide chasms spreading across the fields like ancient scars. The dark, life-giving earth had turned a pale, sickly ochre, dusted with the fine powder of its own desiccation. Walking across it was like traversing a broken, brittle landscape, each step crunching audibly, sending miniature dust clouds spiraling around your ankles. You could feel the parched, unyielding hardness through the thick skin of your soles, a physical manifestation of the land's suffering. It was a soundless scream of thirst. And the crops, oh, the crops, the tender young rice shoots, or perhaps the delicate barley sprouts, which should have been vibrant green and reaching eagerly towards the sun, now stood as testament to a life denied. They were not merely wilting, they were shriveling, their once succulent leaves curling inward, turning a sickly yellow, then a bristled brown. In the dry, hot wind they rustled with a sound like brittle parchment, a faint, mournful whisper of what might have been. Each day, more of them would collapse, their delicate stems unable to support their withering forms, until entire swathes of the field were transformed into a graveyard of nascent life. The sight was a dagger to the heart of every peasant, a visual confirmation of their deepest fears materializing before their very eyes. They looked like ghosts of a future that would never arrive. Desperation gnawed at you. You'd spend endless futile hours trying to coax life back into the dying fields. You might attempt to dig shallow channels, hoping to divert what little water remained in a sluggish stream, only for it to be swallowed by the thirsty earth before it reached the rows. Some would carry precious, meager bucketfuls of water from the dwindling village well, pouring it painstakingly around each dying plant, a futile ritual that only deepened the agony of their efforts. You would pray, of course. You would pray to every saint you knew, to the heavens, to the earth itself, begging for a single drop of rain, a reprieve from the sky's cruel indifference. But the heavens remained silent, the blue unrelenting, the sun merciless. As the weeks bled into months, the grim truth became undeniable. The harvest would be a failure. Not just poor, but a catastrophic failure. The granaries, already half empty from the previous year's meager yield, would remain so. Panic, a cold, clenching fist, began to grip the community. But even as the specter of famine loomed, one truth remained as unyielding as the cracked earth itself: the Lord's demands. For the Lord still collected his taxes, his due. His granaries, maintained by the collective toil of all his peasants, were always replenished first. He lived in a world detached from the daily realities of your struggle. His wealth, his position, his very survival depended on the fixed levies he extracted from his land and his people. A peasant's failed crop was your problem, not his. He had armies to feed, retainers to support, castles to maintain, and a lifestyle to uphold. His bailiff, a stern, unyielding figure, would arrive with his ledgers, his gaze cold and indifferent as he assessed the diminished fields. There was no room for pleas, no space for mercy. Taxes were due, in grain, in labor, in whatever meager coin might exist. The sight of the bailiff, even more than the parched fields, was a harbinger of true despair. You'd watch, helpless, as what little grain you had managed to salvage, the last pitiful reserves in your small mud-walled storage area, was measured out and carted away. Your rice barrel, your grain chest, already mostly empty, became truly, irrevocably hollow. The few sacks of precious, life-sustaining kernels intended to last through the harsh winter vanished, leaving behind only dust and the bitter taste of forced sacrifice.
There was no arguing, no resisting. The Lord's authority was absolute, backed by the threat of violence and expulsion from the very land that sustained your ancestors. To be cast out was a death sentence. With the granaries empty and no hope of a future harvest, the quiet, insidious creep of starvation began its relentless march. The meager meals, already sparse, grew even thinner. The moldy porridge became thinner still, often just a few grains floating in a bowl of cloudy well water. The dark bread, once a dense staple, now became an unimaginable luxury. You began to look for anything at all that might offer a morsel of sustenance. Wild roots, often bitter and indigestible, were dug up. Bark was stripped from trees and boiled, yielding nothing but a mouthful of woody pulp. Leaves, insects, anything that could be swallowed became fair game in the desperate fight against the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. One evening, a scene etched itself into your memory, a testament to the profound desperation that had settled over the village. Your youngest child, their ribs visibly protruding, cried softly from hunger. Your wife, her face gaunt and etched with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue, held in her trembling hand a single, small, withered turnip. It was barely larger than her fist, salvaged from a forgotten corner of the garden that the sun had somehow overlooked. She looked at the turnip, then at her 3 children, all hollow-eyed, silent, their small bodies already losing the plumpness of childhood. With a heart-wrenching, silent resolve, she took a dull, rusty knife and slowly, deliberately, divided the half-turnip into 3 unequal portions. The largest, still pitifully small, went to the eldest, a boy who would soon be expected to work the fields. The middle portion to the girl, who needed strength for household chores, and the smallest, an almost translucent sliver, to the youngest, whose whimpers had become too weak to ignore. There were no arguments, no childish demands. The children, their faces pale and drawn, understood the grim arithmetic of survival. They took their tiny portions with a silent, desperate gratitude, consuming them slowly, carefully, as if to make each bite last forever. You watched your own stomach a knot of pain, feeling utterly powerless. The mother's eyes, usually warm and bright, were now pools of bottomless despair, reflecting the stark, brutal reality of a parent unable to feed their children. This act of sharing, so profoundly loving, was also a profound admission of defeat, a silent scream of agony. As the days bled into weeks, a new chilling phenomenon began to ripple through the village, born of tradition, desperation, and a grim form of self-sacrifice. It always started with the elderly, those whose bodies were already weakened by decades of toil, whose mouths were an extra burden on families with nothing left to give, would make a quiet, unspoken decision. One by one, an aged grandfather, a frail grandmother, their faces etched with the wisdom and suffering of a long life, would begin their last journey. They would rise before dawn, or perhaps after the last mournful flicker of the cooking fire had died, and quietly, without a word, slip out of their huts. They would walk towards the ominous, sprawling forest that bordered the village, a place of shadows and wild beasts, a final, silent destination, and they would never return. There were no tearful goodbyes, no public pronouncements. It was understood. This was the long walk, or the going to the quiet place. The children might wake and ask where grandfather had gone, and a parent would simply murmur, "He's gone to find peace," or "He's gone to be with the ancestors." The survivors were left with a complex tangle of emotions: grief for the lost loved one, guilt for the relief their departure brought, and a profound, chilling understanding of the brutal arithmetic of survival. It was a macabre form of population control, a silent sacrifice made for the slight, almost imperceptible chance that the remaining family members might live to see another spring. The forest consumed them, offering both a final resting place and a means to prolong the lives of the young. And when night fell, The village, usually alive with the soft glow of hearth fires and the muttered sounds of domestic life, became eerily, chillingly silent. That night there was no longer the familiar, comforting sound of pots boiling over fires, no gentle clatter of earthenware bowls. The meager rations had been consumed long ago, or there was simply nothing left to cook. Instead, the darkness was filled only with the sounds of gnawing hunger, the faint rumble of empty stomachs, the restless sighs of children struggling to sleep through the pain, and the occasional sharp cough that echoed unnervingly in the profound quiet. The silence was not peaceful, it was heavy, oppressive, a blanket of despair woven from the threads of starvation and hopelessness. Each hut was a small island of misery, isolated by the overwhelming, pervasive silence. This was the grim reality when the sky withheld its bounty. Crop failure was not just an agricultural setback, it was a societal collapse on a micro scale. It stripped away all pretense of stability, revealing the brutal, naked struggle for existence. The farmer, tied to the land, was completely at the mercy of nature's indifference and the feudal lord's unyielding demands. In this world, survival was not guaranteed. It was a constant, desperate battle, fought with empty hands and hollow stomachs, under a sky that had turned its back on humanity.
When the harvest failed and the Lord's granaries were filled with what little remained, the peasant plunged into a reality far harsher than physical labor: famine. This wasn't the fleeting hunger we know, the rumbling stomach that can be soothed with a meal. This was a pervasive, inescapable hunger, a profound emptiness that gnawed at every cell in your body, driving every thought, every action towards a singular, brutal goal: to eat to live, not live to eat. In the darkest days of famine, food ceased to be a source of nourishment or pleasure. It became a bitter medicine, a desperate means to postpone the inevitable arrival of death. Even the most basic sustenance became a profound struggle. The grains, if any could be found, were rarely clean. They were often mixed with pebbles and other debris, a testament to careless harvesting or the sheer desperation of scraping every last speck from the bottom of a storage bin. The task of pounding these grains into flour was not merely arduous, it was a grueling test of patience and endurance. With rough pebbles for pestles and a hollowed-out stone for a mortar, you'd painstakingly crush each kernel, one at a time. The dull, rhythmic thudding and clattering echoed in the silent hut, as monotonous as the ticking of a rapidly dwindling clock. Each shattered grain was a tiny, fleeting victory, a fragile, fleeting flicker of hope. The resulting flour was far from the fine white powder we know. It was coarse, flecked with bits of husk, and bore the gray, sickly hue of poverty. Sometimes desperation would drive people to grind acorns, wild grasses, or even dried tree bark into the mix, simply to add a scant bit of bulk. And from this coarse, desperate flour came the bread, a lifeline, and simultaneously a torment. This was not the golden, fragrant, inviting loaf we are familiar with. This was dense bread, hard as stone and bitter as ash. It was often baked directly over coals or on hot stones without yeast, creating a heavy, indigestible mass. Its color was typically a dark brown or somber gray, reflecting the low quality of its ingredients. Biting into this bread was like biting into rock. It was so hard it required every ounce of jaw strength to chew, and its acrid, bitter taste lingered unpleasantly in your mouth. Its smell was not that of freshly baked warmth, but of dampness, earth, and profound scarcity. Eating it was a ritual act of survival, a grim acceptance of your place in life's harsh food chain. You didn't eat for enjoyment. You ate because your body screamed, because each bite was a fleeting moment of reprieve from the encroaching death. Hunger was not just a sensation. It was a constant, haunting sound, a dreadful symphony that reverberated within the hut and throughout the entire village. The incessant, gurgling rumble of empty stomachs was a familiar chorus emanating from every member of your family, from adult to child. It wasn't merely the polite grumbling of normal hunger. It was the violent cramping and churning of a digestive system with nothing to process, a desperate cry from a body slowly running on empty. At night, in the chilling silence of the village, this stomach chorus grew clearer, more haunting, a relentless reminder of the emptiness, of the privation that you couldn't escape even in sleep. It was the sound of famine, a sorrowful soundtrack to your very existence. In such desperate straits, every potential source of food was considered a gift, a blessing. Even creatures that, in normal circumstances, would be reviled were now greeted with profound gratitude. The night mouse, typically a pest, a harbinger of filth, was now considered a gift from God. A peasant fortunate enough to snare a mouse in their hut would feel no revulsion. It was a precious morsel of meat. The small creature would be quickly roasted over flickering embers, then shared among the family, each tiny bite providing a paltry but invaluable amount of protein. The faint crunch of tiny bones chewed in the darkness was a testament to the sheer will to do anything to survive. At times, desperation pushed people even further, eating insects, small birds, tree bark, or even desperate measures like consuming clay to fill the aching void in their stomachs. In the face of starvation, a mother's love became both fiercely strong and agonizingly painful. The mother would always feed her children first, then turn away. It was an instinctive act, an unconditional sacrifice performed through a heartbreaking ritual. With gaunt, trembling hands, she would carefully divide the meager portion of food, a sliver of dark bread, a spoonful of thin gruel, or even the tiny piece of roasted mouse among her famished children. Their eyes, hollow and wide with a mixture of hope and weariness, would follow her every movement. After her children had eaten their portions, the mother would turn her face away, either not eating her own share or taking only an infinitesimally small piece, if any remained. This wasn't spoken, it was an act. She didn't want her children to see her deprive herself or to witness her silent agony as her own stomach roared in emptiness. Sometimes she would simply drink a mouthful of cold water to soothe the gnawing pain, or bite her lip to suppress a moan. A mother's pain during famine was not merely physical, it was the torment of a soul witnessing her children weaken daily, knowing she could do no more. Even in your fitful, nightmare-ridden sleep, haunted by the cold and the gnawing hunger, your mind sought a sliver of comfort, a fleeting escape from reality. In that starved world, every dream held the scent of fresh bread, but it was never real. You'd dream of golden loaves, steaming hot from the oven, their aroma rich and inviting. The smell of baked wheat, yeast, and a hint of sweetness you had never truly experienced.
You'd bite into a soft, yielding crumb, feeling the flavor spread in your mouth, a sense of satiety you'd never known. But then you'd jolt awake, back to the cold darkness of your hut, to the familiar rumbling of your stomach, and the musty, bitter smell of the real dark bread. The dream would vanish, leaving behind an even deeper void, an unquenchable craving. This was a cruel irony. Even in the rare moments of unconsciousness, your mind was tormented by hunger, and the only comfort was an untouchable illusion. Life during famine wasn't an existence, it was an attrition. Each day was a battle against physical decay, against the body's primal urges. You didn't live your life, you simply persisted. Each breath, each beat of your heart, a testament to an unbreakable will to survive, even when death lurked perpetually around the corner. Famine was an equalizer. It didn't discriminate by age or gender, only by who survived and who didn't.
After the devastation of the famine, when each breath felt like a small victory against death, a peasant's life didn't return to normal. It shifted into another phase, a new relentless cycle of dependence and unending obligation to the Lord. Your very survival, however tenuous, was now even more inextricably tied to the whims of the one who ruled the land. Sunrise brought no hope. It merely signaled another day of grueling labor, not for your family, but for your master. The Lord's fields were always plowed first, regardless of the state of your own paltry plot. Even if your family's small patch lay fallow, cracked by drought or waterlogged by recent floods, the Lord's land took absolute precedence. You and the other villagers, armed with crude tools and weakened bodies, would sweat over his fertile acres. The Lord's plow horses, far better fed than you could ever hope to be, were rarely put to work without the watchful, unforgiving eye of a supervisor. This wasn't just a duty, it was a stark, brutal exposition of your place in the system, of how your very existence was shaped by another's will. Every clod of earth turned was a testament to his power, not yours. This ceaseless labor wasn't limited to adults. From a shockingly young age, peasant children were burdened with crucial tasks, often far beyond their strength. A child of 6 years old already knew how to fetch water for the crops, a task where their small hands struggled to steady heavy wooden buckets. Their backs would curve under the weight, their thin shoulders chafed raw by the rough rope handles. They knew no true playtime, no schooling. Their world was the fields, the endless, unnamed chores. Older children would work alongside their parents, hand-harvesting grain, weeding under the scorching sun, or tending to the livestock. Childhood was a luxury they never knew. Their labor, however meager, was an indispensable part of keeping the family alive and serving the Lord. And occasionally, like a mocking beneficence, a Lord's guard might pass by, sometimes tossing a coin into the mud or dust. This wasn't a generous gift, it was merely a single paltry coin, just enough to buy a length of rotting rope, or a meager handful of withered seeds, or perhaps a cheap measure of ale at the tavern, a substance that only deepened the hunger, rather than assuaging it. The coin didn't symbolize help. It was a stark reminder of contempt and the insurmountable chasm between their world and yours. It was a way of saying your life was cheap, and even a single coin was more than enough for it. Your obligations to the Lord didn't end with field work or harvesting. Your family and the entire village were bound to perform all manner of other tasks, work that was never truly compensated with anything beyond the right to simply exist on his land. They had to repair bridges, mend roads used by the Lord's men and carriages, regardless of whether those roads served the villagers themselves. They had to gather straw, collect firewood, clear brush around his castle or manor house. All these duties had to be performed without question, without argument, without complaint. These were obligations passed down from generation to generation, etched into your very bones as an immutable law. The slightest refusal meant swift and brutal punishment. The Lord's castle, often perched high on a hill, loomed over the village below, a cold, impenetrable fortress, a symbol of dominance, surrounded by stout walls and armed men. You were taught from childhood to keep your head bowed, to avoid the gaze of soldiers and officials. There was an unspoken but chillingly clear warning. He who looks up at the stronghold will not live long. This wasn't just a saying, it was a grim truth. To lift your head and meet the gaze of the powerful was not merely an act of disrespect, it was a dangerous display of defiance, of daring to dream or question the established order. Those who did, those whose eyes held too much freedom or too much defiance, often simply disappeared, punished as a chilling example to others. The stronghold wasn't just a sanctuary, it was an invisible cage that contained your very life. Each passing day, hope slowly dwindled, replaced by a grim acceptance. Famine continued to gnaw, sickness still stalked, and the Lord's burdens remained undiminished. Everyone knew it. Their eyes grew hollow, and their shoulders slumped under the weight of a life without apparent escape. But then, on one particularly cold and dark night, as the wind howled through the cracks of your hovel, a strange thing happened, a desperate act felt by the entire village, yet spoken of by none. In the thick darkness of that night, as heavy mist obscured even the faintest stars, someone left the village. There was no sound, no farewell. They simply vanished. A family, an individual, or perhaps a young couple who simply could not bear it anymore. The next morning, when the sun slowly, reluctantly rose, an empty hut was all that remained. The villagers who stayed wouldn't speak of it. They would avoid each other's eyes, pretending nothing had happened. Fear and a grim understanding would keep them silent. This departure wasn't an act of rebellion. It was a complete dissolution, a giving up of everything, an abandonment of a fight they knew they could not win. Those who left likely headed deeper into the vast forest, onto unmarked paths, hoping to find a better life, or simply a quicker, more agonizing death. They knew that abandoning the Lord's land was a grave offense, punishable by death if caught. But for them, death on the road was perhaps preferable to the slow, agonizing death by starvation and despair within their own village. It was the ultimate decision of desperation, a faint glimmer of freedom, bought at the highest price imaginable. A medieval peasant's life was a perpetual cycle of dependence. They were born on the Lord's land, lived on the Lord's land, and died on the Lord's land. Everything they had, every task they performed, every breath they drew belonged to their master. Freedom was a non-existent concept. There were only unending obligations. After the relentless dry spell,
After the gnawing spectre of famine and the creeping spread of disease, nature's quiet miracle still unfolded. A new harvest, however meager, arrived. The late summer and early autumn sun brought a fragile glint of hope, a faint promise of continued survival. But for you, the peasant, this harvest season was no celebration of your toil. It was a stark, brutal reminder of your lowly station, a time of relentless labor so that others might feast. As the heavy-headed grains began to yellow, a new sound filled the air, not one of joyous laughter, but of bustling preparation. The loom clacked rhythmically outside the threshing floor, its rhythm steady and ceaseless. This was the sound of weavers hurrying to finish new bolts of cloth, garments destined for the coming festivities, clothes you would never touch, fabrics whose softness was alien to your rough, calloused hands. The scent of dry earth and straw mingled with the faint, unfamiliar smell of new fabric, a strange combination of your arduous life and the luxury that was about to unfold for others. You listened to the clacking, knowing that every thread woven served another's life, a life you could only dream of. And then the real work began. As the Lord's fields ripened, you and the entire village would pour onto them, scythes glinting in the sun. This was the same scene repeated year after year, peasants cutting grain for the rich, not for themselves. For hours on end, under a sun that had softened but still scorched, you'd bend your back, your hands moving swiftly to sever each sheaf. Sweat poured from you, stinging your eyes and soaking through your coarse tunic. Your back ached, a dull, constant throb, and your fingers were perpetually calloused and swollen. Every sheaf you cut, every grain you gathered was carefully measured and carted directly to the Lord's granaries. Not a single kernel was kept for your family, for your own gnawing stomachs. Sometimes you'd see golden grain spill onto the dry ground, a painful waste you dared not stoop to collect, under the sharp, unyielding gaze of the overseers. A bitter resentment would well up within you, a helpless fury at toiling so hard to enrich others, while your own children wasted away from hunger. Once the Lord's harvest was complete, a different atmosphere began to permeate the village, an air of festivity that wasn't meant for you. The celebrations began, often a feast to mark the Lord's successful harvest or a significant religious holiday. Church bells pealed, drums thumped, pipes skirled, and joyful songs began to echo from the direction of the tassel or the large church. You and your family, dressed in your threadbare, dirt-stained, sweat-soaked clothes, could only stand at a distance, watching. The flickering glow of lanterns, the distant sounds of laughter and revelry, the tantalizing aroma of roasting meat carried on the wind, all of it was a distant world, a vibrant, tantalizing tableau of a life you would never experience. The festival music resonated through the air, inviting and mocking in equal measure. You could hear the lilting flutes, the cheerful strumming of lyres, the insistent beat of drums that called everyone to dance. The music drifted into your ears, stirring a vague, aching longing for joy and carefree abandon. But reality was a cruel master. Your shoes were torn and ragged, your toes peeking through, calloused and cracked. Your feet were still caked with mud from the fields, from the muddy paths of the village. Each step you took felt heavy, a constant reminder of your endless labor. The contrast between the joyful music and your ragged, mud-caked feet was too stark, too brutal. You were part of the scenery, but only a ghost of the bustle, not a participant. Your children, despite their weariness and hunger, couldn't resist the allure of the festive lights and sounds. Their eyes widened, staring at the brightly colored banners, the fluttering ribbons, the simple toys being sold by itinerant merchants. They watched the finely dressed people dancing, their faces alight with joy, their smiles radiant. A few younger children might tug at your tunic, their eyes wide with unspoken longing. But they dared not ask. They had learned the bitter lesson of silence, the acceptance of unfulfilled desire. They understood that these things were not for them. As a parent, you felt a sharp pang in your heart, the ache of powerlessness, unable to give your children even the simplest joy. You could only pull them closer or run a hand through their sparse, dry hair, a futile gesture of comfort. The festivities would reach their climax with dazzling displays. In the night sky, fiery bursts would erupt, and then colorful confetti would flutter down. It sparkled for a fleeting moment, then dissolved into the darkness, carrying with it false promises of joy and happiness. But even as the last pieces of confetti drifted to the ground, you were still there, unparticipating, uncelebrating. Your hands were busy either gathering dry straw from the recently harvested fields or cleaning up the scattered remnants of others' revelry. Every stalk of straw you gathered was a reminder of your own unending toil, of your ceaseless service. Their joyful fireworks were the call to your labor. The harvest season, the time of festivals, was not a time of joy for the peasant. It was a season of brutal contrast. It was when you were confronted directly with life's profound injustice, with the unbridgeable chasm between the laborer and the beneficiary. You sweated, you went hungry, you watched your children yearn, only to see others celebrate the fruits of your unending, invisible labor. It was a cyclical existence with no escape, a life defined by unending sacrifice.
Amidst the cracked fields, the crumbling huts, and the oppressive weight of the Lord, another power loomed, permeating every facet of life, the church. It wasn't merely a place of worship. It was an invisible ruler, seeping into the soul, into every fiber of being, every thought. For the medieval peasant, dependence on the church was as profound and inescapable as reliance on the land and the Lord. This was a dependence built on divine fear and the distant promise of salvation, a salvation that seemed reserved for another life entirely. Every Sunday, regardless of how harsh the weather, regardless of how utterly weary your body felt, you were compelled to attend church. This wasn't just a spiritual obligation. It was a mandatory duty, another form of taxation. Beyond the labor and produce owed to the Lord, you had an inescapable contribution due to the church. Each week, one egg, if your chickens were fortunate enough to lay, a handful of grain from the meager store left after the Lord's tithe, all had to be given to God. There was no deferral, no excuse. You'd place these paltry offerings on the altar or into the priest's hand, feeling a bitter resentment well up inside you. These were items that could have fed your children for another day, another meal, but instead they vanished into the coffers of the church, into a system you dared not question. And to ensure no one shirked this duty, the priest would make his rounds, checking on every household, especially during times of hardship, to see who hadn't given their due. He wasn't a physically imposing man like the Lord's guards, but his gaze carried a different kind of weight, a spiritual authority that could make you tremble more than any sword. His voice might be soft, but his words were laden with power, reminding you of hellfire and eternal damnation if you failed in your duty to God. He would look into your hungry eyes, into your children's empty bellies, and tell you this was a test of faith, that your privation was part of a divine plan. He would remind you that those who were stingy with God would receive no forgiveness, and your soul would be condemned. The fear of physical starvation was already a crushing burden, but the fear of spiritual damnation weighed even heavier, compelling you to give what you barely had. Inside the church, you knelt on the cold, hard-packed earth, alongside your fellow villagers, shoulder to shoulder. The priest would drone on in Latin, a language not a single one of you understood. You couldn't read the prayer book. Literacy was a mystery, a privilege reserved for the higher echelons. But you still knelt, head bowed, mimicking the gestures of those around you. You closed your eyes, attempting to feel the presence of God, trying to find some solace in the incomprehensible words. You'd repeat the Latin phrases you heard, even though you didn't know their meaning, hoping that the outward piety would be accepted. The images of the suffering Christ, of martyred saints hanging on the walls, though tattered and faded, still held a terrible power, reminding you of suffering and sacrifice. The fear of judgment seeped into your bones, a sense that your every step, your every thought was being observed by a higher power. And the very concept of sin became even more burdensome in times of want. The priest would preach that greed was a sin, that a lack of faith was a sin. In your mind, that meant that when you were so starving your ribs showed, but dared to hide a single small potato to feed your child, that was a sin. It was a sin against God because you hadn't fully trusted in His providence, hadn't fully surrendered your fate to the church. This pervasive sense of sin was not limited to grand actions. It encompassed even the smallest, most desperate acts of survival. This fear was ingrained in your mind from childhood, an integral part of the social fabric. It controlled you, it guided you, even when your belly was empty and your body was utterly exhausted. Forgiveness, a concept the church preached, did not come easily. It carried the distinctive scent of the church, the heavy smell of burning incense, mingling with the cold glow of the altar candles. It was the scent of solemnity, of an invisible distance between you and God. To receive forgiveness, you had to confess, to repent, to perform penance as prescribed by the priest. These penances often involved endless repetitions of prayers, periods of fasting, even when you were already starving, or other simple forms of physical labor. The incense smoke curled upwards, the candles flickered in the gloom, creating a mystical atmosphere where your soul was supposedly cleansed. But for you, the famished peasant, that forgiveness always felt cold, distant, never truly reaching your heart. It felt like a transaction. You offered what little you had. You endured the pain, and in return, you received a vague promise of salvation in an afterlife. When earthly life was nothing but an endless succession of miseries, your mind naturally sought refuge elsewhere, in heaven. You dreamed of heaven because you couldn't change your life here on earth. Heaven was not an abstract concept. It was a tangible place, described in the priest's sermons and the crude, faded paintings on the church walls. It was a place with no hunger, no cold, no sickness. A place where food was always abundant, where you would never have to toil, where you would be reunited with loved ones lost to starvation and disease. It was a place where there were no lords, no taxes, no discrimination. These dreams of heaven became your sole comfort, an escape from the grim reality. You envisioned yourself walking on streets paved with gold, feasting at bountiful tables laden with fresh bread and savory meats. You saw yourself enveloped in warm light, free from the biting cold or the pervasive smell of mildew. The hymns of angels replaced the hacking coughs and the incessant rumbling of empty stomachs. In that dream, you were no longer a starving peasant. You were a liberated soul, a being cherished and valued. But even that dream carried a bitter aftertaste. It served as a reminder that your current life was unchangeable. There was no escape, no possibility of improvement. Your life was preordained. The promises of heaven were just a way to keep you in your place, to ensure you accepted your harsh fate without rebellion. It was a spiritual opioid, dulling the pain of reality with an illusion of eternal bliss. Your life was defined by a relentless cycle of labor, deprivation, sickness, and dependence. The Lord controlled your body and your labor. The church controlled your soul and your distant hopes. You were a pawn in a grand game you couldn't comprehend, one you couldn't win. Everything you had, everything you were, was taken, leaving behind a naked soul clinging to a distant promise of a better life, but only after you had died.
If famine and disease were unseen enemies, then war was a visible, ferocious beast, bringing destruction directly to your doorstep. For the medieval peasant, war wasn't about the grand battles recorded in history books. It was a sudden, terrifying nightmare that transformed familiar fields into hellscapes, turning you into a silent victim of conflicts that were never your own. It often began with a subtle shift in the air, a chilling premonition. One morning, as you headed to the fields, something unusual shattered the familiar tranquility. From a distance, on the dirt road rarely traveled by anyone but fellow villagers or the Lord's men, you saw a cloud of dust rising. It wasn't the thin, wispy dust stirred by a gentle late summer breeze. This was a thick, churning column reaching high into the sky, like a monstrous entity awakening. The faint rumble at first quickly morphed into a ground-shaking roar, the rhythmic pounding of hooves, the clatter of metal. Your heart seized. This was no natural storm. This was a storm of men. And then they appeared. Not a few familiar patrolling guards, but an army. Heavy cavalry, their armor gleaming in the sun, war horses galloping, sometimes foot soldiers in leather jerkins bearing spears and swords. They cared nothing for the ripening fields, nothing for the impoverished villages that lay beneath them. The cavalry offered no greeting, nor warning, no glance. They simply passed through, riding directly into your lush green rice paddies, trampling mercilessly over the burgeoning crops, crushing the fragile seeds of hope. They trampled the rice, grinding it under heavy hooves, leaving a brutal path of destruction. Whether this devastation was deliberate or simply absolute indifference, you didn't know. What you did know was that an entire season's labor, the last thin hope of surviving the famine, had been annihilated in mere seconds. As the soldiers swept through the village, panic erupted. The screams of women, the cries of children, the desperate shouts of men echoed everywhere. The only instinct was to hide, to conceal yourselves. That night you had to hide in the straw pit, a makeshift bunker beneath your hut's earthen floor, usually used for storing meager grain or root vegetables. The musty smell of dry straw, the damp odor of earth clung to you. The air was thick with terror. You and your family huddled together, trying to maintain absolute silence, even stifling your breaths. Above, the thunder of hooves, the clanking of armored boots on the packed earth, the brutal shouts of soldiers reverberated. The sound of doors being smashed in, of possessions being tossed about. Every noise was a fresh stab to the heart, an agonizing fear of not knowing what was happening outside. In that terrifying darkness and silence, the worst occurred. From outside, you heard the piercing, choked scream of your daughter. A muffled shriek, then a struggle, the sound of hurried footsteps. You tried to rise, your paternal, maternal instinct surging, stronger than any fear. But a strong hand from your spouse or a brother would hold you down, pinning you, forcing you to silence. "No, you'll get us all killed." The scream in your own throat was choked back. You heard the footsteps receding, your daughter's cries growing fainter until they faded into the night. Your daughter was dragged away and never returned. That pain was a wound that would never heal, a perpetual torment. When dawn broke, the soldiers were gone, but they hadn't left without a trace. The village was a scene of utter desolation, a landscape of chaos. Huts were ransacked, doors ripped off their hinges. Your home was burned to the ground, leaving only charred timber and smoking ashes. The smell of smoke and singed flesh mingled in the air. What little remained inside had been plundered. Pots and pans, clothes, tools, even ragged blankets were gone. Your ox was missing, likely taken by the soldiers for meat or to pull their carts. The only source of livelihood, the only pulling power for your family, had vanished. And the fields, not merely trampled, were intentionally scorched, leaving behind blackened, hopeless patches of earth. The rice was ruined, your future crushed. The next morning the sun rose serenely, as if nothing had happened, but the village was irrevocably changed. The next morning the village seemed as if it had never lived. There was no familiar crowing of roosters, no playful shouts of children, no sound of plows turning earth, only a deathly silence, muffled sobs, and the acrid smell of smoke. The survivors crawled out of their hiding places, their eyes hollow and vacant. They looked at each other, faces smeared with ash, clothes torn and ragged. They were ghosts in a ruined landscape. The work of recovery began immediately, leaving no time for grief or lament. With what few crude tools remained, they started clearing the wreckage. They tried to extinguish any lingering embers, salvage usable fragments, and search for the injured or those left behind. Bodies lay scattered across the fields or within the village, the old, those who couldn't hide quickly enough, or those who dared to resist. They were buried hastily, without ceremony, without coffins, just in shallow graves dug by hand. The fear remained, deeper than ever. The trust in the safety of home, of community, had evaporated. Every strange sound, every blurred shape on the horizon sent your heart racing. The soldiers could return at any moment to loot again, to inflict more terror. The nightmare wasn't over. In this age, peasants were the silent victims of war. They did not participate in battles, they had no voice in political decisions, yet they bore the brunt of every consequence. Their lives, already precarious, were utterly destroyed by the conflicts of the nobility. They were the forgotten ones in history, the nameless individuals whose blood and sweat watered the victories or defeats of others. And the pain, especially the pain of your lost daughter, would never subside. It would haunt your fitful sleep in the cold nights as you huddled in your makeshift shelter. It would be a dark shadow accompanying you every day as you once again went to the fields, attempting to revive the ravaged land, facing an uncertain future. War didn't just take possessions and lives, it took a piece of your soul, leaving an emptiness that could never be filled. The village would slowly be rebuilt, brick by brick, straw by straw. The fields would be replanted, seed by seed. But the scars of war would never truly disappear. They would forever be a reminder of human brutality, the fragility of life, and the grim fate of the peasants, the silent victims perpetually caught between life and death, between the dominion of nature and the savagery of man.
In the harsh existence of a medieval peasant, the birth of a child was not merely a joy, but also a heavy burden, a profound question mark over their very survival. And in a world rife with scarcity, disease, and violence, far too many children never had the chance to grow, never knew childhood, never truly lived a full life. This chapter is a poignant reminder of those small souls who came and went like a whisper of wind, leaving behind silent grief and unspoken questions. From their very first unsteady steps, the battle for survival clung to these children. They learned to stand not on strong, sturdy legs, but on thin, spindly limbs. The child learned to walk while malnourished, each step a monumental effort, a temporary victory against sheer exhaustion. Their faces were pale and drawn, their eyes larger than normal, shimmering with childish curiosity, yet quickly etched with a weariness that belied their years. Other children might have had ample mother's milk, been cradled and cherished, but here the mother's milk dwindled as she herself starved, and comforting embraces often had to yield to relentless labor.
Each movement, each rare smile they offered, was a faint, flickering light in the pervasive darkness, a fragile miracle of life in a world that denied it. Their world of play knew no intricately carved wooden dolls or miniature horse-drawn carts. Instead, they played with chicken bones left over from a rare meal, tracing its smooth contours as if it were a precious toy. A handful of dry straw, clumsily braided, might become a tiny doll, clutched close in fitful sleeps. A rotten piece of wood, found by the roadside, became a war horse, a sword, anything a nascent imagination could conjure. Their laughter, if it came, was soft, weak, not the boisterous peals of carefree abandon. Their games mirrored their lives, mimicking plowing, harvesting, or tending to imaginary livestock. There were no purchased toys, no lavish creations, only the ingenuity of poverty transforming life's refuse into fleeting sources of joy. Their world also contained no fairy tales of knights and princesses read from beautiful books. There were no books, no written words for them to learn from or explore. Their only knowledge was transmitted orally, through grim tales of devils, of those who starved to death, of wars, and sometimes simple myths about the world around them. Instead of lessons from texts, they learned by command, commands from their parents in the fields, commands from the Lord when work was needed, commands from the harsh reality of their lives. Fetch water, gather firewood, be silent, work. Each day their lives were shaped by these dictates, ingrained in their young minds that they were born only to obey, to serve, not to question or to dream. They were not taught to read or write. They were only taught how to survive, how to endure. And then winter would descend, like a cold, merciless giant, bringing with it the ultimate fear. In the damp, frigid huts, with meals scarcer than ever, the fragile spark of life in these children would slowly be extinguished. On one particularly bitter winter night, as the wind howled through the cracks and your breath plumed thick in the cold air, a terrible thing would happen. Something so common it had become part of the village's grim rhythm. A child quietly passed away. There was no cry, no wail. Perhaps it was the youngest, the weakest, or one who had just succumbed to a fever. The next morning, as you stirred, stiff and aching, to check on the child beside you, you would find their small body cold and still, their breath gone. Their eyes might still be open, staring blankly into the void, as if searching for a better world. The death of a child in the village was not a public event or a loud wailing. It was a private, silent agony buried deep within their parents' hearts. There were no photographs to preserve their image, no monuments erected. Their names were often not even remembered outside the immediate family. Perhaps their names were already fading even before they died, considered as transient beings who could disappear at any moment. They were buried hastily, without a coffin, simply wrapped in a plain shroud, in a shallow grave in the cold earth, often in the communal churchyard or even just outside the hut. Tears might fall, but there was no time for prolonged mourning. Life had to continue. The living had to persist. And for the mother, that pain was deeper, more persistent than anyone else's. It was the pain of carrying, giving birth, nurturing, and then watching her child depart without being able to do anything. But even in that soul-crushing grief, the mother had to go on, to survive. The mother would continue to weave as if she had never given birth to that child. Her hands would still deftly pull the threads, the loom would still clatter, producing coarse cloth for the family or for the Lord. Her face might be expressionless, her eyes vacant, but her body would continue to function like a machine, obeying the rhythm of the harsh life. This continuation was not indifference, it was a brutal survival mechanism, a painful denial of the grief in order to keep breathing, to keep laboring. Deep within her heart, the child's image remained, but outwardly, life had to proceed as if the child had never existed, as if the loss had left no mark. Medieval peasant children were souls caught between two worlds, the world of innocent childhood they never knew, and the harsh adult world they were forced to confront too soon. Their childhoods were stolen by hunger, disease, and duty. Early death was a familiar visitor, an unavoidable part of life. They were small candles extinguished too quickly, dreams that never fully formed, vanishing into nothingness. The story of the children who never grew up is the story of millions of tiny beings who lived and died anonymously throughout that era. They are a vivid testament to the brutality of a time where even the most fragile lives were left unprotected. They are a reminder that behind the grand battles and magnificent castles lay countless tragic tales of common folk whose fates were determined by the harshness of nature and the cruelty of man. And in her fitful sleep, the mother still dreamed of the smell of milk and the warmth of a small body beside her, a dream that would never come true.
In the brutal existence of a medieval peasant, where every day was a fight for survival, profound emotions like love seemed an unattainable luxury. It wasn't expressed in flowery words or romantic gestures. It was an invisible thread connecting two weary souls, a silent pact to endure and survive together. Love among peasants wasn't a fairy tale. It was a painful choice, another burden in a life already overflowing with them. It often began slowly, almost imperceptibly, amidst the endless, repetitive work in the fields. Two young people would catch each other's eye across the row of vegetables. Fleeting glances exchanged while their hands deftly pulled weeds or harvested crops. Perhaps it was a girl from a neighboring family, or a boy from the same village, someone you had grown up alongside, sharing the same hardships and brief moments of peace. Chance encounters at the village well, accidental touches while carrying firewood, or quick whispers amidst the bustle of the market. These were the tiny sparks that ignited a fragile flame. There was no time or space for elaborate courtship rituals or romantic declarations. Love blossomed from a mutual understanding of shared difficulties, from an empathy for souls trapped in the same fate. The opportunity for a first rendezvous was exceedingly rare and fraught with risk. There were no cozy taverns or lit pathways. Such a clandestine meeting involved only the moonlight and the distant barking of dogs. Perhaps it was an evening after the fieldwork had ceased, when the village had settled into sleep, that you would slip out of your hovel, trembling not from cold, but from anxiety and anticipation. You'd meet your beloved in some secret spot, perhaps beneath the ancient oak at the forest's edge, or near a small stream. The faint moonlight illuminated their face, highlighting the harsh lines already etched there from a childhood of toil. There were no grand words, only awkward touches, tight embraces in silence. The distant barking of dogs echoed, a constant reminder of ever-present danger and surveillance. Every moment together was a risky act, a stolen pleasure from a world unwilling to grant it. A betrothal between peasants involved no gold rings or lavish ceremonies. There were no rings, no jewelry to exchange. Instead, there was only a vow made over dry straw, a silent promise in the dimness of a hut or under the moon. That vow was simple, heartfelt, and deeply meaningful. I will work for you. I will stay by you. It was a promise of labor, of support through hard times, of facing hunger, sickness, and oppression together. Perhaps there might be a tiny token exchanged, a braided string, a simply carved piece of wood, or a dried flower, a fragile symbol of a firm commitment. The elders in the village would witness this vow, not with joyous celebration, but with a deep understanding of the hardships to come. They knew this love was not a ticket to happiness, but a shared burden. And once committed, they would live together, often in a section of an existing hut, or by constructing a new, crude shelter. They would share a piece of stale bread, their daily staple, a symbol of the poverty they mutually accepted. And they would share a ragged hovel, a meager refuge against the elements' harshness. It was not a cozy home, but a place of mere existence, where they could shelter from the cold, the heat, and the rain. Each day they would go to the fields together, share their meager meals together, endure the Lord's oppression together. Their intimacy was built on the sharing of burdens, on rough, caring touches, and silent, knowing glances. Their love needed no grand declarations. It was expressed through small acts of care and profound sacrifice. But in this brutal world, love could not withstand sickness. It couldn't drive away fever, couldn't heal wounds, couldn't stop the spread of plague. When illness struck, it stripped away not only health, but also love itself, leaving behind unimaginable suffering. You might lie beside your beloved, holding their hand tightly, praying fervently, but the sickness would not relent. You would watch the light in their eyes slowly fade, their ragged breaths grow weaker, until at last a terrible silence fell. Love, no matter how fervent, became powerless against the destructive force of disease. It only made the pain of loss deeper, for you lost not just a partner, but your companion in the struggle for survival. And then life had to go on. Burials were often swift, hurried affairs. There were no stone markers or elaborate rites. Your beloved would be quickly interred, returned to the earth. But their mark remained, especially their personal belongings. The one who remained, the widowed wife or husband, would have to continue living, continue fighting. And one of the most haunting images was seeing that person go to plow wearing the shoes of the deceased. Those shoes, perhaps old leather boots, or simply pieces of hide bound around the feet, were now worn by the living. They might be a bit too loose or a bit too tight, but they were an essential item that could not be discarded. With every step taken in the field, Those shoes served as a constant reminder of the one who was lost, of the steps they once walked, of the labor they performed. The smell of old leather, of caked earth clinging to the shoes, became the scent of memory, the scent of loss. Wearing those shoes wasn't just a necessity, it was a painful ritual, a way to hold on to a small, tangible piece of the departed, an endless reminder of the cost of love in a brutal world. It was a continuation, not a replacement. You couldn't replace the person, but you had to continue to labor, to exist, bearing the burden of both the living and the dead.
In the grueling, confined life of a medieval peasant, where every day mirrored the last and the future seemed irrevocably set, the concept of the city was more than just a place. It was a dream, a faint flicker of hope for a different existence. It was woven from whispered tales in the dead of night, rumors carried by rare merchants and pilgrims. The city was a symbol of freedom, of opportunity, of a world unshackled from the Lord's grip and the endless cycle of the fields. Rumors of the city drifted into the village like a foreign wind, carrying the scent of the unknown. People spoke of vast markets where goods were piled high, from fine silk cloth to exotic spices from distant lands, things you had never seen in your life. They spoke of cobbled streets, tall houses crammed together, and the shimmering lights at night, not the flickering warmth of hearth fires, but the brilliant glow from hundreds of candles and lanterns, transforming night into a kind of day. More importantly, there were whispers of freedom. Freedom from the Lord's direct rule, freedom from the endless toil in the fields, freedom to do as you wished, to become whatever you could become. To peasants bound to the land, the very idea of owning your own destiny was an irresistible lure. In every village there were always a few young souls who yearned to taste that freedom, even for a fleeting moment. And so, one early morning, before the sun rose, a young boy, his heart pounding in his chest and a crust of stale bread in his pouch, secretly followed a merchant. The merchant, with his heavily laden carts and a face hardened by long journeys, was the only tangible link to the outside world. The boy walked tirelessly, clinging to the caravan's heels, trying to remain unnoticed. Each step was a break from the past, a stride into uncertainty. Fear and exhilaration mingled, creating a sensation both liberating and terrifying. He envisioned a new life, one without the whip of the overseer, without the constant gnawing of hunger. The journey was long and arduous, through wild fields, dense forests, and winding rivers. Finally, after many days of relentless walking, the marvel appeared before his eyes. From a low hill, a new skyline emerged. Not the familiar thatched roofs, but tall structures of wood and stone, packed together like the teeth of some enormous beast. And then the city revealed itself fully. It was an assault on every sense. The noise was ceaseless, a chaotic symphony of shouting vendors, clavering cartwheels on cobblestones, neighing horses, church bells, and the constant hum of thousands of human voices. The smells were just as overwhelming. not the familiar scent of damp earth or straw, but a pungent, unsettling blend of sweat, refuse, charcoal smoke, strange spices, and the distinct stench of too many people and too little sanitation. It was a sharp, acrid smell the boy had never encountered, and it was suffocatingly crowded. Thousands of people jostled on narrow streets, in dark alleys, bumping into one another, pushing past, each hurrying to their own unknown purpose. There was no quiet, no personal space to be found. The boy tried to blend into the throng, feeling utterly small and lost. In his village, everyone knew everyone. Here, no one knew who he was. No one asked where you were from. No one cared about your story. You were just another face in an endless sea of humanity. The initial feeling of freedom quickly gave way to a profound loneliness. There were no neighbors to share a meager meal with, no familiar faces to turn to for help. You had to navigate the streets alone, survive alone. The city was not the promised land, it was a cruel maze where only the strongest could hope to endure. The first night in the city was a terrifying experience. There was no warm hut, no familiar roof. You had to sleep under a bridge or in a dark alley, huddled among other nameless, homeless figures. The cold of the stone and the dampness rising from the river seeped into your very bones. The city's cacophony never truly ceased, even at night. Shouts from taverns, the hurried footsteps of wanderers, and the scuttling of rats nearby. In fitful sleep, haunted by fear and cold, you dreamed of your mother. The warm scent of the hearth, your mother's hand stroking your hair, her soft voice singing a lullaby. The dream offered a fleeting comfort, but upon waking, the reality was even harsher. A deep homesickness gnawed at you, a profound regret seeping into your mind. The days that followed were a relentless struggle to survive. The boy took any work he could find, hauling goods in the market, cleaning stables, or begging for scraps. He learned that money governed everything in the city, and he had none. He competed with hundreds, thousands of others also desperate for a morsel. He faced the disdain of the rich, the contempt of the city guards, and the brutality of street ruffians. He had to learn to cheat, to steal, just to stay alive. The city, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like another prison, one built of stone and indifference. After months, perhaps a year, of wandering through the city, the boy realized the grim truth. The city was no paradise. It was just as full of hunger, disease, and oppression, merely in a different form. He was still an outcast, a voiceless person, a lost soul. The freedom he sought had turned out to be the freedom to starve on a strange street. The dream shattered, leaving behind a profound disappointment. And so, one day he decided to return. He knew the village was not a good place, but at least there he had a name, a family, a patch of earth to belong to, however temporarily. He began the journey back, retracing the familiar paths, paths that now held a different meaning. Each step was a return to the chains, but also a return to familiarity. When he reached the edge of the village, everything seemed the same weathered huts, the same parched fields. He walked into the village, hoping to be greeted with hugs, with questions, but no. One day you returned to the village, and no one greeted you. The other peasants, old friends, neighbors, merely looked at him with empty, expressionless eyes. Perhaps they were accustomed to those who left never returning. Perhaps they no longer recognized him, his face too changed, deeply etched with the marks of the city. Or perhaps, and this was the most painful realization, they didn't want to greet him because his return was a stark reminder of the hopelessness of their own lives, of the shattered dream, of the brutal truth that there was no escape. He returned a stranger in his own home, carrying the sorrow of a dead dream and the heavy burden of knowledge. The city, the dream of freedom, turned out to be nothing but an illusion. And for the peasant, there was nowhere to go, nowhere to escape the relentless cycle of their destiny. They were trapped between the land and illusions, between starvation and false promises. The dream of seeing the city was a costly lesson, a brutal reminder that sometimes the worst thing isn't having no hope, but having hope only to see it cruelly shattered.
In the relentless cycle of a medieval peasant's life, where each day was a struggle for existence, death was not a sudden tragic event, but an inevitable, almost anticipated punctuation mark, a release from the burdens of being. For a peasant who had lived through famine, war, and countless harsh harvests, a final day often arrived quietly, without fanfare or tears. It was the death of an unknown person, a mere speck in the vast tapestry of history, yet a whole world to the loved ones left behind. He lay there, huddled on the thin layer of straw in the damp, cold hut. The man lay in the hut, eyes unopened. His breathing was shallow, labored, each gasp a struggle against the encroaching silence. His wrinkled, pale skin clung tightly to his bones, his gaunt face etched deep with the marks of a lifetime of relentless toil under the scorching sun and biting cold. His eyes, which had seen too much suffering and too little joy, were now closed, lost in a private world no one could reach. Perhaps he was dreaming of a verdant field without stones, or a loaf of white bread that wasn't bitter, or simply the warmth he so rarely felt. Beside him, his old wife, her gray hair disheveled, sat in silent vigil, her eyes empty, staring into nothingness. She didn't speak, didn't cry, simply existed, waiting for the inevitable. The children, if any remained, would stand at a distance, looking at their father with a mixture of fear and grim acceptance. They had seen this too many times before. In the corner of the hut, where the weak daylight could not penetrate, the axe stood, covered in dust. It was a simple tool, its blade dulled by thousands of chops, its wooden handle smooth from sweat and the calluses of his hands. The axe wasn't just an implement, it was a symbol of his entire life, a life defined by labor, by the swing of the axe for firewood, for digging earth, for mending fences. It was a silent testament to the strength he once possessed, to the burdens he had carried. Now it just stood there, inert, coated in the dust of disuse, waiting for another hand to claim it. It was a cruel memento, a reminder that his life had served its purpose. When the last breath left the frail body, a strange silence settled over the hut. There were no sobs, no wails,
No one cried, only a distant owl hooted from the dark forest. This was not a lack of feeling, it was the grim acceptance of an inalterable reality. In this world, tears were a luxury they could ill afford to waste. Grief was an old friend, too familiar for overt displays, having become woven into the fabric of life itself. The hoot of the owl, a sound of the wild, untamed nature, became the only requiem for a life concluded. It was cold and distant, just like death itself. It was the call of the encroaching darkness, beckoning a soul back to the earth. The burial was swift, unceremonious, without pomp. His life held too little consequence to merit a grand farewell. They carried him out of the hut, his emaciated body wrapped in a rough shroud, with no coffin. They couldn't afford a coffin, and the earth was too hard to dig deep. They buried him near the village, perhaps at the edge of a familiar field, or in a patch of unused ground where others too had found their final rest. They buried him at the foot of a tree, an ancient oak or an ash that had witnessed generations come and go. There was no headstone, no carved name. The grave was just a small mound of earth, which would soon be leveled by rain, wind, and the footsteps of passers-by. The axe would never be laid beside him. It was still needed by the living. And then the name vanished with the last harvest. His name, a simple, common village name, would slowly sink into oblivion. His children and then his grandchildren might remember it for a short while, but the relentless pressures of life would quickly erase all non-essential memories. There were no papers, no records, no history to preserve his identity. He became part of the very soil he had labored on his entire life, part of the endless cycle of birth and death. He was anonymous, one among millions who had lived and died in the same way, leaving no trace on the surface of history. But life somehow went on. The ceaseless cycle of survival had to be maintained. On the very land the man had spent his life tilling, sowing, and harvesting, a new generation would continue. His grandchildren, with their small hands and slender shoulders, would go to the fields. On that land his grandchildren would once again begin to plant rice. They would know little of their deceased grandfather, perhaps just a vague name, a quickly recounted story. But they would walk the same paths he had walked, touch the same soil he had touched. They would face the same hunger, the same cold winters, the same oppression from the Lord. The cycle continued, with no end in sight. The peasant's life was a legacy of repetition, an inheritance of duty and endurance. The death of one individual changed nothing. It was merely a small void instantly filled by the next generation, by new hands that would continue to labor on the same old earth. The death of a peasant was a grim lesson in impermanence and the insignificance of the individual in a vast and harsh world. There was no grand commemoration, no solemn funeral, no eulogy, only a quiet disappearance, and life continued without missing a beat. It was the fading of a soul that had toiled relentlessly, a life lived with the sole purpose of existing. And in the eternity of land and time, that death was a profound reminder that in the grand cycle of nature and feudal society, each individual was merely a grain of sand, a stalk of rice, an inseparable yet ultimately unremembered part of a larger whole. The man was dead, but the struggle continued. The hunger remained, the Lord remained, and the church remained. Life continued to demand what it wanted, and the living would continue to work until it was their turn to lie quietly under an unmarked mound, beneath the same tree, under the same indifferent sky. That was the peasant's life cycle, born, worked, died, and forgotten.
In a world that constantly rushes, where every moment seems to pull us forward at a dizzying speed, there lies a sanctuary, a peaceful space hidden deep within each person. It's not a physical location marked on a map, but a state of being, a gentle dance of mind and spirit. This is the story of a journey to find stillness, to learn to listen to the voice of silence, and to discover solace in your own inner world. Our lives often resemble a strong current, constantly sweeping us along with thoughts of the past and worries about the future. We swim in that current, trying to grasp each moment, but ultimately find ourselves exhausted. What we often miss is the beauty and peace of the present moment. This isn't a complex philosophy. It's a simple truth obscured by the dust of habits and hurriedness. Imagine an early morning when dew still clings to the leaves and the sun has just begun to rise. In a normal day, you might rush out of bed, thinking about your to-do list, appointments, and anxieties. But now, allow yourself to pause. Close your eyes. There's no need to force anything. Just feel the softness of your bedding, the lingering warmth on your skin, or the cool touch of the morning air. This isn't a waste of time. It's an investment in yourself. We often think of meditation as a formal activity, requiring us to sit cross-legged in a quiet room with candles and incense. But in truth, meditation is simply bringing your awareness to the present moment without judgment. You can do it while sipping a hot cup of tea, feeling the warmth spread through your palms, smelling the aroma of the tea leaves, and tasting the slight bitterness on your tongue. Each sense is a gateway leading you into this moment, the only moment you truly possess. Try listening to the sounds around you. Are there birds singing, the wind rustling through the window, or the faint hum of distant machinery? Don't try to name them. Don't judge them as noisy or pleasant. Just listen. Let those sounds come and go, like waves lapping on the shore. Each sound is a reminder that life is happening right now, here, all around you, and you are a part of it, fully present. When your mind begins to wander, which is perfectly natural, gently bring it back. Like a mischievous puppy, your mind will scamper off. Don't scold it. Just offer a gentle smile and guide it back to your breath. Your breath is always there, always your anchor in the flow of time. In our busy lives, we breathe without awareness. breathing becomes an automatic action, a bodily function we rarely pay attention to. But breath is more than just air entering your lungs. It's the bridge between body and mind, the rhythm of life itself. By focusing on your breath, you can rediscover peace, no matter how chaotic the outside world may be. Lie down or sit comfortably in a quiet place. Place one hand on your belly and the other on your chest. Inhale deeply through your nose, feeling the cool air enter your lungs, expanding your chest and abdomen. Feel your belly rise under your hand. Then exhale slowly through your mouth, feeling relaxation spread throughout your body, feeling your belly fall. Repeat this cycle, not trying to control your breath, but simply observing it. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Imagine each inhale bringing in peace, tranquility, and each exhale carrying away worries and tension. Inhale relaxation, exhale fatigue. Inhale freshness, exhale old, unnecessary things. Let your breath become a flow of renewal, washing away the heaviness in your soul. As you focus on your breath, you might notice other sensations in your body, perhaps an itch somewhere, or a slight tension in your shoulders, or a pleasant warmth in your legs. Acknowledge these sensations. Don't try to push them away or cling to them. Just observe them, like clouds drifting across the sky. They come and they go. Your breath is a loyal friend, always with you, never abandoning you. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, your breath is always an available resource for finding peace. When you feel anxious, stressed, or simply disconnected, remember your breath. Take a deep breath and feel life circulating within you. It's a gift, an inner source of strength you can always access. Our minds are like gardens. Sometimes they're overgrown with the weeds of worry and negative thoughts. But if we tend to them, planting seeds of peace and stillness, they can blossom into a wonderful sanctuary. Now, we'll embark on a journey through your own inner landscape, exploring its hidden corners and finding relaxation. Lie down comfortably. Close your eyes. Feel your body completely relaxed from the top of your head to the tips of your toes. Begin by focusing on your head. Feel relaxation spread across your forehead, through your eyes, your jaw. Feel all tension releasing. Then shift your attention down to your neck and shoulders. Often, this is where we accumulate a lot of tension. Imagine all burdens sliding off your shoulders, falling to the floor. Continue to move your awareness down your arms, hands, and fingers. Feel the warmth and looseness. Then move to your chest and abdomen. Take a deep breath, feeling your belly rise and fall gently. Feel relaxation spread down your back from top to bottom. Finally, focus on your hips, thighs, calves, and feet. Feel the pleasant heaviness of your body as it sinks deeper into relaxation. Feel yourself held firmly by the earth,
During this journey, if any thoughts arise, acknowledge them. Don't chase them, don't judge them. Just gently notice them and let them float away, like leaves on a stream. Don't cling, don't hold on. Your mind doesn't need to do anything at all. Now imagine yourself standing in a peaceful place you love. It could be a deserted beach with gentle waves, a quiet forest with sunlight filtering through the leaves, or a small garden with the scent of flowers. Use all your senses to experience this place. Smell the fragrances, hear the sounds, feel the gentle breeze on your skin. Immerse yourself completely in that scene. This is your sanctuary, a place you can always return to whenever you need peace. Stay in this space for as long as you like, feeling safe and relaxed. Let all worries dissolve. Let your mind become empty and light. This is a moment of rejuvenation, of recharging your soul. After your inner journey, your mind and body are now deeply relaxed. This is the perfect time to drift into the flow of sleep, allowing yourself to sink into deep, restorative rest. Sleep isn't just about closing your eyes. It's a natural meditative state where your body and mind heal and refresh. Imagine yourself lying in a small boat, gently drifting on a calm river, free of strong currents or obstacles. The night sky above you is a velvet black, sprinkled with stars that shimmer like diamonds. The river carries you gently, effortlessly. You feel completely safe, supported by the water. The gentle sound of the water is a soothing lullaby, rocking you to sleep. Each of your breaths harmonizes with the rhythm of the river, calm and steady. Feel the pleasant heaviness of your body as it sinks deeper into the boat, into the water. Any lingering thoughts in your mind have now dissolved, like thin mists dispelled by sunlight. Allow yourself to completely let go. Let go of all worries about tomorrow. Let go of all regrets about yesterday. Let go of any remaining tension in your body. You are safe. You are protected. You are loved. As you sink deeper into sleep, imagine yourself diving into a clear, still lake. Each time you go deeper, all sounds, all distractions disappear. You feel enveloped by absolute peace, a silence so profound you can hear the beat of your own heart. Let sleep come naturally, gently, without force. It's a gift you deserve to receive. Let your body recover. Let your mind rest. Let your soul be renewed. You are entering a world of healing, where all burdens are lifted and you are surrounded by absolute tranquility. Feel the warmth spreading from your heart, a gentle light radiating throughout your body, bringing peace and serenity. This light protects you, embraces you, and guides you into deep sleep. As you drift deeper into this relaxed state, imagine a word or phrase that brings you a sense of peace. Perhaps it's peace, stillness, safety, or relax. Repeat this word in your mind, gently, softly, like a whisper. Let that word become the rhythm of your soul, guiding you deeper into sleep. Even as you drift deep into slumber, the peace you found will always be there. It doesn't disappear. It simply hides, waiting to be reawakened. Sleep is a reminder that we don't need to control everything, that there are moments when we simply need to let go and trust. Trust that your body knows how to rest. Trust that your mind knows how to restore itself. And trust that inner peace is always an available resource waiting for you to discover it. Each morning when you wake, you can carry a little piece of this peace into your new day. By taking a few minutes to breathe deeply, to listen, to feel, you can reconnect with the stillness within. Life will still be busy, challenges will still arise, but you'll have a stronger foundation to face them, an inner wellspring of energy to overcome any difficulty. Remember that the journey to find stillness is a continuous one, not a destination. Every moment you dedicate to yourself, every conscious breath you take, every time you gently guide your mind back to the present is a step on that path. You are nurturing the garden of your soul, planting the seeds of peace and happiness. And now, allow yourself to fully drift into sleep. Let everything go. Safe, peaceful. As we close this journey, carry with you the deep sense of peace you've found. Stillness is not the absence of noise, but the presence of a calm mind amidst all the chaos. It is the light you can carry in your heart, no matter the darkness of the world outside. Remember, whenever you feel lost, whenever you feel stressed, your sanctuary is always there, within you. Just close your eyes, take a deep breath, and listen to the song of silence. It's always singing, just waiting for you to hear it. Sleep well. The story has come to a close, soft as a wisp of smoke fading into the quiet night. Everything that needed to be said has been gently spoken, like closing an old book in silence. Now you can turn off the screen, pull up your blanket, and let your mind drift into sleep. Or stay just a little longer and let the final images echo gently within you. Thank you for listening. If you felt a sense of peace, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell me when you listened and what touched you. Wishing you the gentlest of nights.